On today's show, we are less than a week out from the NBA draft. I've got a friend with me today. We're going to talk about some prospects that we could see the Cavs taking at number 20.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. You can find the show wherever you get your podcast. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, Apple, Spotify, anywhere else. Also, can find the show on YouTube. Be sure to like this video if you're watching. Subscribe to the Locked On Cavs YouTube channel, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Use the promo code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. I'm Danny Cunningham. You might know me from my time covering the Cavs at places like Cleveland Magazine, 92.3 The Fan, or some other places once upon a time. Today, a very special guest joining me, someone that knows the NBA very well, someone that knows the NBA draft very well, and of course the Atlanta Hawks very well, as well as Locked On Hawks host Brad Rowland. Brad, how are you today?
I'm doing well. I appreciate you having me on, and always fun to do Locked On Cavs. One of my favorites.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that. Certainly Locked On Hawks is a great show, one of the better ones, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Be sure to check that out. As you know, if you are an NBA draft person seeking this out, obviously there's a ton of draft talk going on there right now as the Hawks have the number 1 overall pick. Obviously the Cavs are at number 20, so there's been a little bit less interest there. But I do have a couple of names, Brad, that I want to talk about with you because I know you are much more insightful into the NBA draft than I am, which is why I wanted to have you on today's show. I'm starting to, well, not starting to, but I've been looking through, a ton of different mock drafts recently as the draft now is less than a week away next Wednesday. Cavs picking at number 20. There's 3 names that I see pretty routinely pop up in various mock drafts, whether it's at The Athletic, ESPN, Bleacher Report, so on and so forth. But the name that I'm seeing the most of right now is Bub Carrington out of Pitt. What I've noticed from him, he's a guard, a little bit of a bigger guard than what the Cavs have now, listed at 6'5". He was not all that highly ranked out of high school. I believe he was the number 99th overall prospect in the country. What do you think about his NBA future? What do you think about him as a draft prospect?
Yeah, he seems to be a guy who has risen quite a bit in the last, not even necessarily since the season ended, but late in the season and into the offseason, but was kind of a draft Twitter favorite before then. You mentioned kind of off the radar guy coming into college, but I think particularly, with the way he can kind of be a pull-up shooter and the way that he operates pick and roll, it's very easy to see how it would work in the NBA. He has a pretty translatable game to the league. I think he also measured like a 6'8" wingspan, which is a good data point for him, especially because, one of the questions, if you want to go down that road, is how athletic is he? Which kind of impacts his defense. Like he doesn't have the best like steal and block rates, for instance. Some of those indicators that you might like to see about a bigger guard, like you mentioned. But he's really young too. I think if he's not the youngest guy in the class, he's on the list of youngest guys in the class. And if the jumper goes in, I think that he's going to be a guy who probably returns like lottery value. He's that kind of player. If not, then it becomes a little bit like, what role is he going to be best in? But I'm certainly a fan, and I think the people I trust tend to like him even more than like the consensus, quote unquote.
So I think the biggest question with a lot of these guys, and it's certainly fitting with Carrington, and I'm glad you said this exact phrase, but you said if the jumper goes in, right? Like that I think is the big separator for a lot of guys, whether they're international players or collegiate players or, G League Ignite, Overtime Elite, so on and so forth. If the jumper goes in is going to be the thing that decides whether or not they're good in the NBA. What are your thoughts on the way that he is able to put the ball in the basket? I know that, it might not be the best looking jumper you've ever seen. He might not have the best numbers from the outside, but do you have reason to believe that he can be someone that is a pretty good shooter from the outside once he does get to the NBA?
Yeah, I generally buy it. I don't know if he's going to be a great shooter, but a good enough one. Given like he can create a shot, which I think really does matter. A lot of it, I don't think he's going to be the most efficient player in the world because I think he's going to take some difficult shots. Like he's not afraid to take a pull up. That's probably his like most appealing skill in some ways. But they're sort of the bar is a little bit lower if you can get to your own shot and create their own shot, and you don't have to be a super duper efficient guy if you're doing that as a guard, especially with the way he passes the ball. Inside the arc, I'm a little bit more concerned. Like that's more of a question for me is like, can he score inside the arc than it is with a pull-up jumper? And I guess the nightmare scenario is that he does neither. And then then it's like, what are we doing here? Which is why he's available maybe at 20. You know what I mean? If there wasn't that question, he wouldn't be maybe available in this range. But I do generally buy the shooting.
What's his playmaking like? What can you tell us about that as far as how he is getting others involved? Because if the shot's not going in, you do have to provide something, and maybe that could be it. I don't know if that's enough to keep him on the floor at the NBA level, but you do have to be good at something. And if it's not the shooting, if it's not the scoring, I would think it has to be that as a guard that also might not be the best defender in the world.
Yeah, I think he sees the game well. He was certainly placed in a scoring role in college, which is not a surprise. A lot of these guys who, even if they fall down the board, they were the best player on their team in college. So they're going to be more of a scoring role. I don't think he has to be like in a pure scoring role. I think the way he, especially runs pick and roll, but even like his skip passing is really interesting. He seems to have good feel of like where guys are supposed to be, putting the ball in the pocket correctly as a passer. So I don't think he's like an uber elite passer, but someone who I think is a good enough passer to do what he needs to do to be able to kind of threaten defenses as a scorer and a passer, which is what you really need for a guy who may not be elite at either one, but the fact that he can do both opens up a lot of avenues.
So I want to move on to the next guy that I've got written down. I've got three guys again. First one, Bub Carrington out of Pitt. Up next is someone playing a little bit of a different position than Carrington, obviously. That's Deron Holmes, big guy out of Dayton. He's someone that, Brad, that I look at that, maybe he could fill a role in the NBA as someone who is he doesn't necessarily have the size you would love to see from a center, but he does possibly bring the outside shooting versatility that I think actually could be a great fit with the Cavs should they decide to go in a different direction away from Jarrett Allen at center and play Evan Mobley there full time more often. I actually think he could be a solid fit if that's the direction they want to go. What do you see with Holmes?
Yeah, actually, that theoretical of him and Mobley does really work. I think the fact that Holmes, he's not tiny for a center, 7'1" wingspan, but he's not a 7-footer by any means. Like he's kind of that tweener size in the front court. But honestly, the way that I would frame Ron Holmes is that he's just really good at basketball, and that's a very broad statement on purpose. But he's older, which is part of the reason why he's probably going to fall kind of to this range. But he was a legitimate All-American at Dayton and was excellent the last couple of years. Super efficient. You mentioned the jump shooting. I buy that development there as a pick and pop guy. Really good feel for the game. Really good passer, I think, for a big man in particular. Can rebound, can block shots. Like he checks a lot of boxes. He's not like the best athlete in the world, but he's really developed a lot. I guess if you want to be worried about the age and the fact that he, got better during college, which is usually a positive thing, but there's this thought that maybe as guys get older, it becomes easier in college, and it can kind of trick you a little bit. I don't really see that with Deron Holmes. I think the traits actually really work. The question for me with Deron is like, is he going to be a starter? But I really buy him as a rotation player at a minimum in the NBA.
So I sort of think that I want to ask you about this comparison that I have when I watch him, but I do wonder if he could be like a Naz Reid type. And I know that they have very different stories where Naz Reid, I believe, was a one-and-done guy at LSU, didn't actually get drafted, signed originally a two-way with the Wolves, and then was put on one of those Sam Hinkie special contracts before his first season. But could you see him developing into that type of a player?
Yeah, I think it's not a bad analog at all. Naz, what's really, really popped with Naz Reid is that he's become like this, like let it fly shooter. And I don't know if Deron's going to be that, but he already was comfortable taking threes and I think he made 39%, something like that, high 30s last year at Dayton. So yeah, I can kind of see that. And look, Naz Reid, I think still at this point is probably ideally a third big for you. He can start for a lot of teams, but he was the third big in Minnesota. It felt like a perfect role for him in a lot of ways. And that might be Deron Holmes, which again, at 20 is totally fine. If you can get a guy who's a third big for you at 20, who's a good player, that actually is a positive outcome, even if I'm sure Cavs fans are probably looking for like, entrenched starter. I think quality rotation player at 20 is usually a good outcome.
Well, I do think you have to have realistic expectations when you're picking at 20. Like the Cavs put out something on Thursday on social media about notable 20th overall picks that have played for the team in franchise history, and it's like Zydrunas Ilgauskas. Okay, that's a pretty good 20th pick, and Karis LeVert's another one. Like if you find a Karis LeVert type player, not necessarily that position, but that type of impact at number 20, I think that's a huge win. Like I do think you have to be realistic with what to expect when you're picking outside the lottery, even the back half of the lottery. Like it can be such a crapshoot at times.
No, I will save my long spiel, but I generally agree with you. And I wish I'd drive this home. Like people's expectations, generally speaking, for each draft slot down the board are always too high. And I think if you look at, you sort of can do some historical looking back about what the average outcome for a 20th pick is. I promise you it's not a starter. So it's one of those things where if you get a starter, that's great. And now, Z was obviously a starter. Karras is like a fringe starter, like third wing type kind of guy. That's kind of the same translation for someone like DeRon Holmes. If he becomes a third big, that's a good outcome.
All right, last guy that's been mocked to the Cavs pretty frequently is Kaon George out of Miami, 6'8", a wing type player, 6'10" wingspan, I believe it's listed at. Shot just over 40% from deep this year. What do you think about his possibility of being a good quality NBA rotation player that could be available at 20?
Yeah, there's quite a split on him. I found, like, even within people like Intel circles, there's a big some people see him as like a potential top 15, top 20 pick, and then there's others that have him like as a second rounder. It's one of those, and that's not that big of a split, but you know what I mean? It's not like there's a consensus on him. Part of that is that he just, I don't mean this in a negative way. He wasn't like a great college basketball player. Like it's more tools than production. For instance, I think he averaged like 12 points a game, which isn't scoring and everything. I'm not actually a huge scoring equals production guy personally, but like he doesn't have huge counting stats. You actually shot it well. That's the biggest appeal for me with George, is that if you think that's a real thing of him being a 40% three-point shooter, that's how he becomes a quality NBA player. I mean, there's been comparisons to like Cam Johnson. They have a very similar body type as a shooter. I think Cam was a better shooter, but also was an older guy coming out of UNC, all that stuff. So I think the big thing is that he has to make shots. If he doesn't make shots, I don't love the secondary stuff with Kaon George. But if he makes shots at a high level from three-point range, then I can sort of see how it's appealing.
Yeah, I think with him, it's the phrase you mentioned earlier. It's whether or not the ball goes in the basket on the jumper. It's to the extreme with him. Like I don't see a ton more other than if he makes shots, he's going to be good. If he doesn't, I'm just not sure where he's going to fit in the NBA. I don't necessarily see it. He's probably the guy of the three that we've talked about that I'm not the highest on. He'd probably rank third amongst this list for me.
Oh yeah, definitely for me too. And I don't mean that as like to pile on. I kind of uniquely like Carrington and Holmes, so it was good. Without even conferring with you about those guys necessarily before this, I have Georgia a tier or two lower. It doesn't mean it'd be a ridiculous pick, because I don't think it would be. And I do think that if he shoots the way he did this last year in college, then there is a path. But to your point, it just kind of has to be that, I think.
Up next on Locked On Cavs, I've got three guys that might fall to 20. They've consistently been mocked above where the Cavs are picking, but if they fall, would they be good fits? We'll tell you about those guys next right here on Locked On Cavs. But today's show is brought to you by Prize Picks. With Prize Picks, you could turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. You can make a Prize Picks lineup in as little as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on between 2 and 6 players' stat projections. It's not hard to do. Just 2 and 6, more or less. That's all you have to do, and you are locked in. If you're looking for promotions too, Prize Picks has you covered every week. On Tuesdays, they lower select players' stat projections, which obviously increases your chances of winning. On Friday, hey, that's today, if you put together a losing lineup, you can get your entry fee back. Isn't that what everyone wants? A little bit of a free do-over, if you will. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with over 5 million active users. Get in on the daily action with your friends and become part of the Prize Picks community today. The finals are over, but the hoop action has not stopped. Women's basketball just getting started, season obviously underway. Young stars like Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, they're looking to make name for themselves alongside obviously greats like Breanna Stewart, Asia Wilson, so on. You could win up to 100 times your cash by watching them ball out. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA, that's LOCKEDON NBA, for a first deposit match of up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Prize Picks. So those guys that we've talked about have consistently gone around number 20. Some have been, maybe a pick or two before, maybe a pick or two after, or right on 20 to the Cavs. I now, Brad, have three guys that have gone somewhere, I think, for the most part, between like 14 and 18, maybe 14 and 20. And the first guy I want to talk about, and he is one of the hottest names, not necessarily because I think he's going to be a great NBA player, or even a lot of people think he's going to be a great NBA player, but he's a great college player, and that is Zach Edey from Purdue. I've got questions about whether or not he's quick enough to stay on the floor defensively, if he can switch out onto guards and not just get cooked over and over and over again. I also have questions about whether or not he can be an effective offensive player if the offense isn't built around him the way it was at Purdue. How do you see his transition to the NBA going?
There's definitely a notable split on Edey, to your point. One of those two concerns is my main one, and it's the defense, right? I think that, just say this out loud, and you alluded to it, he was a generationally fantastic college basketball player. Like, there was this notion, and I'll keep it short, about like how he was quote unquote just big. And it's like, that's not true. He was actually just like fantastic. And no, he is huge. He's absolutely enormous. That's the thing. He's absolutely enormous. But he took advantage of that. And I think he used it. He's very skilled as for any, he's very skilled. Keep that in mind. But defensively, that is the question is, can he move his feet in space? He got better at that as his college career went along, but the NBA is a different level. And even in the Big Ten, not always the most athletic conference in college, like, he had some moments at times. I think it's more plausible to me that he can do it now than it was a year ago when we were talking about him as a potential draft entry. But still, that's my number one question is, can he hold up in space? And that's why I don't have him as a lottery pick like some do. But the rest of it is pretty appealing to me. I think offensively, yeah, he's not going to be the focal point, but man, he's a fantastic screen setter. Like, your guards are going to love him in a lot of ways. He will just plow through guys in the perimeter. And he just has natural gravity as being as big as he is. Great rebounder. So, like, there's lots of boxes that you check. It's just, can you draft him in the first round or in the top 20 in this case? If you don't think he can hold on the perimeter, that's a pretty interesting question.
Who would you compare him to in terms of his offensive game? I don't want to necessarily rag on the guy for maybe not being able to hold up defensively, so I don't know that we need a comp there. But just in terms of his size and skill, who can you think of that makes sense to, if it works out for him, this is what he looks like on the offensive end of the floor?
Yeah, I mean, the hard thing is there just isn't anybody that's like, physically. No, I mean, there are guys who are as tall as he is. Like, Wemby's almost as tall as he is, if not as tall as he is, but Wemby's just such a different player. Like, you have to go, like, modern day. The only modern day comp, like, physically, is like Boban. And I think that if you watch Boban off, and it's a very similar problem potentially, is that Boban's always been a really good offensive player. He's always been really efficient. It's just that he truly could not hold up defensively at all on the perimeter, and that's the downside. The downside risk is that he's Boban, who's an NBA player, and he's been in the league for a long time, but no one is clamoring for Boban in the rotation in 2024. So that's the downside risk. I mean, offense, you have to go back to like previous iterations of the NBA to have a guy that's like built on post scoring and all that stuff the way he was. And I think honestly, he's a rare guy where you can throw him the ball and I think he's going to score. I really do. Like, even though I'm not a big post up guy in the modern NBA, a lot of teams don't do that. I think he can score on almost anybody. I really do. It's just how much you want to emphasize that.
Right, and I do wonder how often teams are going to allow him to post up, because when you're drafting a guy at 20, typically, or in the range that Edey is projected to go into, typically you kind of have some of it figured out. You're not one of the worst teams in basketball, so you're not going to be throwing the ball into him in the post repeatedly, because you should have a relatively respectable offense. So I wonder what his offensive game looks like if he becomes more of someone who is an awesome screen setter and dives to the basket afterwards. Like, that could be maybe his blueprint if he's not getting those post touches, of still being a really effective offensive player.
Yep, I totally buy it. And I really do think that he's going to be a good offensive player in the NBA. It's just, how good is that question, and then it's the defense, and that's why he's going to maybe be available in this spot. Up
next, Tristan Diaw. Wing, maybe a tweener type out of Colorado. The thing I like about him and why I think he could be a really good fit at the Cavs if he falls to number 20. I've seen a lot of him going 17th to the Lakers, but I think he might be one of the better pure shooters in this draft. And that's something, as I watch him, I think, okay, maybe not everything that he does is something that he can take with him to the NBA, but I think that jumper is something that will follow him to the NBA.
Yeah, I agree. I think he was incredibly efficient this year as a shooter. He kind of profiles to me, and this is very broad on purpose, but as like a fifth starter type where like, let's just say in Cleveland, for instance, while we're talking about the Cavs, like if he's your fifth starter and he just doesn't take a lot off the table, the shooting really plays up. He makes the right reads. He's a legitimate dribble pass shoot guy. And like that's appealing as a package offensively. And then I think defensively, he isn't going to be great. He's not the most athletic guy in the world. There's a reason why he was still in college after 4 years. Like he's old. He's 23 already. And that's why. But I do think that he can move. And he's got decent size, 6'8". He's a legitimate small forward size player. But I think that he just doesn't take much off the table. That's my general appeal. And you're right. If the shooting is what it was this last year at Colorado, and it generally has improved all the way, mechanics are good. Not to go back to our trope from earlier, but if the shot goes in, then like everything else plays up because he doesn't really have a glaring weakness other than you could say athleticism. Everything else is kind of like pretty solid, and the shooting might be what pushes him up a level.
He to me, as I watch him, he screams out a guy that, I don't think he's got a super high ceiling, but I think he's got a pretty high floor.
Yeah.
I think that the most likely outcome, and I think it's just like overwhelmingly likely, is that he is that fifth starter or like the seventh or eighth guy on a team that's really good for a long time. Like that's how I think his career could play out. And I don't think anyone should be surprised by that.
Yeah, I have a friend, Brian Schroeder, who does this really well, and he's compared De Silva to Jaime Jaquez. It's a little bit of a different profile because Jaquez is a better athlete, but Silva's a better shooter. And it's like, kind of an older college player, really good college player, maybe slips too far. And Jaquez isn't going to be a star either, but he's already proven to be a starting caliber player who you would like to have on your team. And I think that's kind of what De Silva maybe looks like. Again, that might be a little bit aspirational because Jaquez has gone perfectly. And I loved Jaquez. But even then, like, let's just say we fast forward and Jaquez now is like what he was in 2 years, on like year 3 or 4 instead of year 1 or year 2 when he was that good. I think that's a pretty reasonable comparison.
Last guy I've got here for this section of the show is Johnny Furphy, wing out of Kansas. I think the thing that is appealing is that he's got great numbers as a spot-up shooter. That is the thing that if he can take that to the NBA, I think he'll be really good. Yeah,
another guy who the shot's got to go in, but I definitely see that. He was a weirdly late riser too in this process. Like he was barely playing at Kansas early in the year. And he got injected in the starting lineup, had this meteoric rise, and kind of held that and to the point where he's a projected first-round pick. He's really athletic, I will say. It's just one of those things where can he impact the game in other ways other than shooting and like the occasional transition play? But I do think the shooting is real, and I think he's he's like measured at 6'9" something like that. Yeah, 6'8" without shoes. So he's very skinny and not that long wingspan wise, but a good leaper, good athlete, and if the shooting plays, the shooting plays.
Up next, we'll talk about whether or not it's best to draft for need or to just take the best player available right here on Locked On Cavs. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you've got to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. I'm someone that I've been looking for jobs in the past. I've lost jobs before. I've wanted to make advancements in my career before. So when I have been looking for jobs, where have I gone? LinkedIn. That's where I go to look for jobs. I like to think I'm the type of person that if I'm looking for a job, you should be looking for me. Where am I at? LinkedIn Jobs. That's why it's the place to go for you. LinkedIn's not just another job board. It has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals. This is billion with a B. It's a lot of people, a lot of professionals. And of course, that makes it the best place to hire. Gives you access to professionals you cannot find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Pretty quick. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/LOCKEDONNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. So, Brad, I think one of the more interesting discussions to be had when it comes to drafting is should you be taking the best fit for the team, or should you just be taking the best player available? And I really don't think that either answer is right or wrong. I think it's so situation dependent. But for the Cavs, I do think with where they're at, the fit might be more important than just the best player available at number 20.
I think we agreed broadly on what you just said about like it's never as cut and dry as BPA versus fit at any point in the board. I think as you go down the board, I think fit becomes more of a tiebreaker. Like a number one overall, for instance, I'm covering the team right now that has the number one pick, for instance, and there's this huge debate. Of course, it's like, do you take the guy best on the board, or do you think about fit at all? I mean, and I think that you have to. For me, it's always you have to think about fit around your core guys. So if you're the Cavs, you have several core players who you're invested in, right? And does this player fit with my core guys does really matter at every spot. And it's I think that in general fit, and also I think when people say fit, they think positional fit, and it's not just positional fit. It's also like what does your coach run? Like what kind of skill set do you have versus the skill set the other guys have on your team? So fit is a nuanced thing in itself, but I generally agree that as you get later in the draft, it matters even more in theory.
I actually think one of the other fit things that's worth talking about is age too.
Yeah.
Like, where is the team at amongst its developmental process? Because sure, the Boston Celtics just won a title, but like they're still developing certain players. They're just as far along as you get in the developmental process. The Cavs are in a developmental process, as every team is. But because they are a team that's made the playoffs each of the last 2 years, that just won a series this year, they could be undergoing some pretty big changes this offseason. But they're a team that's expected to, at the very least, be a top 4 team in the Eastern Conference again next year. So you sort of, I think, want someone that's able to play right away. So if you're drafting someone that's 22 or 23 years old, I think that's a lot different than if you're a team like the Detroit Pistons that won 14 games last year. I think it makes more sense there. Maybe draft that 19-year-old if all things are equal.
Yeah, it's also about what are you looking for from this pick. Both, can they help you now? Do you want them to help you now? Do you need them to help you now? In the NBA, it's backwards. Like the draft's before free agency, right? And I know there's every joke to be made about free agency happening kind of in the shadows before the draft, which is probably real, but you don't know in theory what you're going to be able to plug holes wise in the NBA. Like you're drafting in this vacuum before that stuff really happens. And yeah, it also depends on what your roster looks like. If you have a lot of free agents that are hitting the board, there's a lot more flux. If you have a team that's like coming back in full, are you drafting a player that's going to help you now or long-term? And also realistic expectations for what that player is. If you're drafting a project, that's okay, but you have to remember that you're drafting a project and plan accordingly, both with that player and also who else you bring in. And messaging is weird too, to both to the player, to the agent, even to your fan, which just doesn't matter as much. But it's like if you're drafting this like 18-year-old guy who isn't probably going to help you for 2 years, kind of try to make that somewhat clear that they're not going to suddenly be your starting small forward. You know what I mean? It's one of those. There's lots of nuance, and it's never as clear. And for me, last thing before I stop rambling. You also want to tier these guys up. That's what I do anyway. Like I wouldn't want to break a tier to draft a guy who for fit. I think it's more of a tiebreaker or a tier breaker than anything else. Like you don't want to reach too much because the fit's weird. There's also nuance there.
No, I think that's something that totally makes sense. Because like if there is a player that is very clearly head and shoulders above the next best player, but might not be the best fit, it might be worth just trying to figure it out. Like that is a very real thing. Like if they're, and I don't think that is so much in play at 20, especially in a draft like this where I don't think that there's necessarily a ton of future all-stars in it. And maybe you disagree with that. I'm sure there will be a couple, but I don't think that this is anything that's ever going to be compared to like the class of 2003, for instance. But as you get further down, I think that just that talent level goes down. So fit might rise up a little bit.
Yeah, I think one thing that could happen, I'm not saying it's going to at 20, just to put it in practical terms, is it's more like maybe somebody falls unexpectedly. Like last year, Cam Whitmore fell way down the board, and it was a surprise, and it was for health reasons and whatever intel reasons, but it was a surprise on the day, and he was like a consensus top 10 guy who fell, and it's like you got to be ready if you're the Cavs or whoever for that guy. Like if that guy falls to you, it's like, okay, what do we think about this guy? Not only intel wise, but he would, like, let's just say Ron Holland or one of these guys that are like, I think are going to be gone by the time the Cavs pick, but have been kind of falling in some mock drafts. Isaiah Collier is one where like these guys are seen as like kind of some of the higher end talent guys in this class. But if they fall unexpectedly, do you care about that as the Cavs, or you're gonna let those guys go by and kind of more go for fit, more go for need, or however you want to put that? It's interesting because it comes down to how you feel about the player, and and it's never a vacuum. There's always stuff that matters. There's always machinations around that you have to decipher as a team. Intel stuff that we never hear about on the outside. It's very, very complicated.
Yes, it is a science. And Cam Whitmore did fall all the way down to number 20 last year. We'll see if something like that happens this year. Before I get you out of here, who do you think the Hawks should take number 1?
That is the question for sure.
That's why I had to ask.
I
couldn't let the
it's fine.
Hawks guy leave without asking that.
I don't blame you. I think if I wasn't allowed to trade down, or there was just nothing to trade down, I would take Alex Sarr. I'm not married to that. He is my number 1 player on my board, but it's not in his own tier. I think that, speaking of tiers, that's a good example where if the Hawks go with somebody else, I'm not going to throw things. I think it'll be very understandable despite having Alex Sarr number 1. But trading down is never sexy. You'll probably hear that if you ever bring that up for the Cavs. Fans don't like trading down as a general rule. Not everyone, but most of the time. But especially number 1 overall. I proposed that. I guess on my show proposed that, and nobody likes that. I wonder why that is. It's like, Anyway, but yeah, Alex Sarr, if you made me choose right now, I'll take Alex Sarr.
Fair enough. Brad, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Very much appreciate it.
It was my pleasure to be on.
Thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. You can find me on Twitter at RealDCunningham. You can find Brad at BT Rowland. Of course, you check out Locked On Hawks, and of course, everything he writes at Dime. Some really great stuff there. Be sure, if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. Also, like this video on YouTube, subscribe on YouTube. We will be back on Monday. Maybe the Cavs will have a new head coach. If not, we will continue talking about draft, as that is only a few days away. We've got so much to get to. Keep it locked right here at Locked On Cavs.